I think we're about ready to start. First of all, I want to welcome everyone and thank you for trudging through the snow to join us this afternoon. I am Sonia Alvarez. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies, and also a professor in the Department of Political Science. And on behalf of both those programs, I welcome you formally. I also am delighted to welcome our distinguished guests who are here to talk with us about an extremely politically timely, if not urgent, set of issues. And so I thank them also for having braved the weather and joined us. There's always a weather story in Massachusetts, it seems, when you hold anything. So at least, you know, we were in keeping with the spirit of the University of Massachusetts. Before I turn it over to my friend and colleague, Jamie Rowan, who is the real specialist and brains behind this operation today, she's going to introduce substantively what we'll be doing for the day. And she and I have been scheming about this little happening since about September, I think, when she first joined us in the department. So first of all, I'd like to thank Jamie for her efforts. I'd also like to thank our sponsors. As always, we had funding from the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, from the Political Science Department, support from the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies, as well as from the Horowitz Endowment. Thanks also, therefore, go to the staff of all of these units, especially Crystal Paul in political science and the rest of the staff in the department, Gloria Bernabe Ramos and Carolyn Parker at the Center for Latin American Studies. And then we have, you will see, lots of enthusiastic volunteers from my Intro Latin American Politics class and from Jamie's Legal Studies 394 class. So thank you all, and Jamie will let you know what we're actually going to be doing.
Thank you all for coming. We woke up this morning and said, wow, you can do a lot of planning and then who knows what's going to happen. But I'm glad to see you all. I'm excited about this event. I think it's going to develop over the next few hours into something really nice. And it's going to start with something really great. So, you know, just to give you a little conceptual background, this conference is really organized around the idea of, as the title says, the global politics of truth and justice. And we wanted to bring together scholars in New England that have really important things to say about war crimes tribunals, truth commissions, and really how to redress mass violence. And so in reaching out to the various scholars, we wanted to make sure we had a diverse group that are studying these different mechanisms in different parts of the world, but because it's the Center for Latin American Studies, Caribbean and Latino Studies, we really did focus on Latin America. Dr. Pasha Bueno Hansen is our first speaker and is going to be presenting on her recent book, which is called Feminist and Human Rights Struggles in Peru, Decolonizing Transitional Justice. And just to give you some background on Dr. Bueno Hansen, you can read in this, but I'm going to just read it for you. Dr. Pasha Bueno Hansen earned her doctoral degree from the University of California, Santa Cruz in Politics, Feminist Studies, and Latin American and Latina Studies. At the University of Delaware, she holds the positions of Assistant Professor of Women and Gender Studies and Director of the Sexualities and Gender Studies minor. She is affiliated with the Political Science and International Relations Department, as well as the Latin American and Iberian Studies program. Dr. Bueno Hansen has published a book by the same title, as well as journal articles on book chapters on issues including sexual violence, feminicide, women of color, feminism, sexuality, race, transitional justice, internal armed conflict, and social movements. Dr. Bueno Hansen places her research and teaching at the service of social justice. And in thinking about who would be a wonderful respondent for Dr. Bueno Hansen, we tapped into our incredible resources here at UMass and are pleased to be having Dr. Angelica Bernal presenting her comments on Dr. Bueno Hansen's wonderful book. So Dr. Bernal is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and faculty affiliate with the Center for Latin American Studies, Latino Caribbean Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She received her PhD in political science from Yale University and her BA from Wellesley College. Dr. Bernal specializes on popular constitutionalism, the politics of constituent change, indigenous rights and social movements, extractivist politics, and indigenous resistance in Latin America. Most recently, she completed a book entitled Beyond Origins, Rethinking Founding in an Age of Constitutional Democracy, that examines the politics of founding, refounding, and the role of the people in the creation and recreation of political orders. So this first panel is going to be a dialogue, a presentation followed by comments from Dr. Bernal. After that, from 2:45 to 3, we're going to take a brief coffee break, and we're going to start right at 3 with our next panel. I won't go through all of the introductions, but you can see who the speakers are. And on that panel, we're going to broaden out the conversation to look at these different mechanisms in action. After that, at 5:30, you are welcome to stay if you make it for the afternoon. We're going to have wine, beer, and a lot of food. And so you are, spend the afternoon with us. We really hope that in the discussions, you're active participants. This isn't about, professing. This is about actually engaging in dialogue. So especially for the students who are here, there is no bad question. Please ask a question that comes to your mind. Ask what interests you. Ask how this might apply somewhere else, something you've heard. Our speakers are educators, and we'll be happy to engage with you on what interests you about these really important and timely topics. Thank you to our sponsors. Thank you, Sonia, for enabling this to happen. Crystal, who's not here, and as she said, and all the other people who have been instrumental. And thank you to our speakers. Please.
Good afternoon. I want to thank Jamie for that lovely introduction. And I also want to thank Sonia Alvarez. And I wanted to just comment that way back at UC Santa Cruz, when I was an undergrad, I took her Latin American politics class. And that was quite inspirational. And that, I would say, was one of the first elements that took me on this trajectory. And then a decade later, I came back to Santa Cruz to work with her in the politics department and pursue a doctoral degree. And I had the fortune of working with her for about 4 years until you all stole her away over here at University of Massachusetts Amherst. And so I wanted to just be very explicit about how much my work is indebted to the training that Sonia Alvarez dedicated to me. I also want to thank Crystal Paul for all of her organizing. She's just, I don't know if she's here today, but I hope to meet her so I can thank her in person, and of course the sponsors that were already listed. This talk is based on my recently published book, and before I get into, let's see if this is gonna, we should have done some testing ahead of time. I got it, okay. Before I move into the story that I have to tell you today, which traverses the Peruvian internal armed conflict and the subsequent transitional justice process, I'm going to start by explaining how I enter into this conversation about mass violence and human rights, the global politics of truth and justice. So I am a feminist interdisciplinary scholar with activist commitments. And my book directly engages the questions that animate this conference, questions such as how can transitional justice mechanisms such as tribunals and truth commissions better serve survivors of conflicts, and how can they better and more accurately create the story of an account for what happened, the mass violence and harms. So in Peru, the armed conflict was between 1980 and 2000, and my book examines how state and civil society groups address gender-based violence that took place during the internal armed conflict. And gender-based violence, I want to just give you a sense of what that is, and it's violence that is directly targeting women because of their gender. And I want to read to you from the UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which explains the concept of gender-based violence by identifying any act, quote, that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion, or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or in private life. So, I'm going to be sure I get this right. So, Peru obviously, after the conflict, started a transitional justice process, and the big piece of that, the central piece, was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that took place between 2001 and 2003. And my book obviously looks at that commission, but it continues to also look at Peruvian human rights and feminist movements and their responses. And also I focus in on one feminist NGO, non-governmental organization, and their follow-up work was obviously a focus on gender-based violence and how they negotiate between the sort of universal international human rights frameworks and how those can be used to, attempted to be used to holistically address gender-based violence. And of course there's a big gap there. So for this talk, I want to highlight the challenges and lessons learned. So challenges and lessons learned, first through the experience of the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and then through the experience of that feminist non-governmental organization's follow-up project. And my goal is to offer structural, procedural, and methodological interventions, possibilities for future transitional justice projects. And through this, I'm going to bring your attention to one case, which is the emblematic case of Manta and Vilca of sexual violence. And sexual violence is, if I just explain to you gender-based violence, sexual violence would be a component of that, which includes sexual slavery, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced sterilization, and rape. And this Manta Vilca case was taken up as an emblematic case of how sexual violence took place in the rural context around military bases. And this case is also a grounded way to talk about the challenges and lessons learned from the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission's investigation all the way through to the psycho-juridical work that this feminist NGO has done over the years with the women that they represent. And most importantly, to answer sort of the so what question that Sonia used to ask me when when I was a doctoral student, so what? So what's this all about? What's the what? This case is poised to set very significant precedents. And I'll start then with the current status and significance. So, going on to thinking about a brief sort of context to this case. In the 1990s, as most of you are probably aware, the international tribunals of the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, for the first time, set up jurisprudence regarding wartime sexual violence as a crime against humanity. And then you can also refer to the International Criminal Court's Rome Statute. So as many of us also in the room might be aware, there's a case in Guatemala, a case of sexual and domestic slavery at the Sepur Zarco military base in Guatemala that took place in the 1980s. And this case is going to trial now, right? And this is very powerful, and these crimes against humanity are being held, the trial is happening within the Guatemalan judicial system, which is also very significant, right? And what I want to kind of connect to this is that in Peru, this case is set to follow suit. We have, let me see if I can set it up here. We have an indictment that came through last year, which recognizes this sexual violence as a crime against humanity. And I say should be going to trial because the date has not been set. And the process by which the date gets set is very murky. So should be going to trial this year. There's expectations that it will go to trial this year. And it is one of the first cases of sexual violence of the internal armed conflict to reach this point in the Peruvian judicial system. And I do want to highlight that there's another human rights non-governmental organization that's called APRODE, Asociación Pro Derechos Humanos, or Association for Human Rights in Peru, that at this moment has two cases that are going through the courts. These two cases include sexual violence as torture, in addition to a whole bunch of other human rights violations, such as forced disappearance. So sexual violence is coming to the fore. It is moving, it's starting to move through the Peruvian judicial system, but the difference is that it's being tried as torture, while in this case it's being tried as a crime against humanity. So another thing I want to highlight before I get too far into this is that There's another human rights organization called IDL, Instituto de Derechos de Defensa Legal, which is the Legal Defense Institute, that is also trying defending another set of women from the Manta Vilca case, but as torture, right? So there's this parallel going on. The feminist NGO that I worked with, who's representing various women under the rubric of crimes against humanity, and this human rights organization that's representing other women from the same community under the rubric of torture. So it's definitely, this issue of sexual violence is definitely coming through the rubric of torture, but what's particular and special and significant about this case that I'm looking at is that they're framing it under crimes against humanity. So one of the things that's so significant about the crimes against humanity is that then you can establish responsibility up the chain of command. Now, with this particular case, the indictment includes 12 soldiers and 2 low and middle ranking officials. The captain of the base at Manta and the commander battalion in the capital city of Huancavelica. They haven't established chain of command further up, and that I'm going to comment on later. That is sort of the next goal. So, what I want to lastly say here is that this case is clearly poised to end impunity for this human rights violation in Peru, similar to the Sepur Zarco case in Guatemala. So at the end of this presentation, I'll circle back to current advocacy, and I'm very interested in seeing what people might have to contribute to my ideas around that. So now we're going to turn to Peru, the internal armed conflict, transitional justice process. So here we have Peru, and many of you might be familiar that Peru has 3 regions: the coastal region on the Pacific, the Andean region, and the Amazonian region. The capital of Peru, Lima, is on the coast. And the Peruvian internal armed conflict started when the Shining Path, the Communist Party of Peru, in 1980, rejected formal incorporation as a political party into the Peruvian political system. So during the 1980 elections, the Shining Path burned ballot boxes in the rural Andean community of Chuchi, Ayacucho, and took up arms to basically overthrow the government in a Maoist revolution. So here's some kind of things I pulled off the web that I thought were sort of good visuals. You can see Abimael Guzman in the glasses, and his inspirations, Karl Marx, Lenin, and Mao Zedong. Clearly this is a peasant struggle, a peasant people's war, and in the other sort of, the image of the people writing political graffiti, don't vote, don't take part in that 1980 election, take up arms for the people's struggle. And another kind of interesting note about this group is that they very much saw women's fury as an incredible, powerful element to contribute to the class-based revolution. So break the chains and let's go for class revolution. Other armed actors include the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement and armed forces. So while this conflict was initiated in the Southern Andean department of Ayacucho, during the 1980s it spread out into other Andean departments and also Amazonian departments. And given the centralized spatial configuration of Peru, geography is a very, very significant factor. The coastal capital of Lima holds a majority of administrative decision-making power. It holds the concentration of Spanish-speaking, literate, educated, wealthy population. And while the rural Andean Amazonian regions get characterized as sort of backwards, needing development, needing progress, and there's a concentration of poverty, Quechua-speaking population, and illiteracy. So a feminist geographer, Maureen Hayes Mitchell, offers a spatial analysis of the internal armed conflict in Peru, and she makes a connection between, on the one hand, geographic isolation, social exclusion, political marginalization, with the selectivity and intensity of the violence. This is directly connected. So this spatial configuration traces back to the history of Spanish colonialism and all the exclusions based on ethnicity, language, so forth. And this geographic analysis is very crucial for understanding the historic layering of violence and its aftermath. So you've got this Peruvian nation state in crisis due to a bloody civil war or internal armed conflict in the 80s and 90s, and also the fall, which I won't comment too much on, but the fall of Alberto Fujimori's authoritarian regime in the late 1990s. And in that crisis, Peru, the nation state, the administration decides to take on a transitional justice process, right? And they are basically trying, and I'll just do a little definition here because I'm assuming most of you know about transitional justice, which refers to a period of time between the end of a conflict or authoritarian rule and the establishment of democracy, rule of law, peace, right? So it's this temporally sort of bound concept of mechanisms that will be able to help in that process. So this could be both judicial and non-judicial measures that help to redress mass human rights violations, and some of those mechanisms could include criminal prosecutions, truth commissions, reparations programs, institutional and policy reforms. And all of this I'd like to embed in this aforementioned historical, social, and geographically based inequality that's the backdrop for the Peruvian transitional justice process. So Peru, as I already mentioned, decided to implement a Truth and Reconciliation Commission 2001 to 2003 to reflect on the past and construct the future. That's this first image here. They investigated and documented human rights violations, including kidnapping, torture, disappearance, extrajudicial executions, assassinations, and sexual violence. And they conducted 17,000 interviews, held public hearings, and the top image is an image of the public hearings. You can see the commissioners all standing around the back of the table. And I want you to note the composition of the body of commissioners. And when the people, the testimoniantes, the people who came to give testimony, finished delivering their testimony, they would pass in front of the table and shake hands and greet and have short conversations with all of the commissioners. So public hearings modeled after South Africa. They prepared also 47 legal cases through a judicial unit, and they published a final report, which is the bottom image, with then President Alejandro Toledo holding up one of the many tomes of the final report. And I want to note, it's worth noting that the commissioners belatedly added a gender unit into the investigation to facilitate gender analysis, but belatedly is the key word here. So according to this final report, the majority of the almost 70,000 victims who lost their lives were Andean Quechua speakers or Amazonians from various different ethno-linguistic groups. And 75% of those killed were of indigenous origin. And while the Truth Commission notes that the perpetrators of the human rights violations were the majority Shining Path, the armed forces committed the vast majority of sexual violence, 83%. So this is a noteworthy variation in terms of perpetration of human rights violations. And the victims, the profile of the victims is significant too. They occupy the bottom ranks of the social hierarchy, from reflecting 75% Quechua speaking, 83% from rural areas, the majority with a primary education or less, in between the ages of 10 and 29. So we're talking a lot about young women, or girls, really. So besides the very obvious fact that the majority of the victims of sexual violence were female, it's very clear that other socially marginalizing factors must be taken into account when analyzing this human rights violation. So given this, I want to just reflect on one of the main arguments in my book, which is that the success of the state and civil society to address gender-based violence during the internal armed conflict hinges upon attention to multiple exclusions based on ethnic and linguistic factors, class, geography. And when I say ethno-linguistic factors, I'm indicating indigeneity, and I'm indicating that through ethno-linguistic factors because the Andean population that I was in contact with, in particular, did not self-identify as indigenous. So I don't want to impose that onto people because no one wants to have categories imposed upon them, and that's a basic respect. So the Quechua-speaking population affirms themselves through the rubric of Peruvian citizens and peasants, rather than mobilizing around indigenous identity. And then, of course, my goal is to offer the structural, procedural, and methodological interventions. So, to talk about, in terms of the contributions and by reflecting on the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I want to think about some of the challenges and lessons. And one of the overarching challenges, which I think is typical for most transitional justice mechanisms, is this extremely short timeline, very bound, and limited resources. So trying to do so much for the first time and trying to figure it out while doing it, and it is a quite overwhelming process. And I want to make a side note that while it becomes more and more evident that transitional justice mechanisms have so much difficulty delivering on their promises, we demand more and more and more of them, right? So this is part of sort of this paradox. So the first level that I want to look at are the structural lessons, looking at policy, looking at the legal normative frameworks. So one of the main challenges particularly was this issue of the add-on, of the belated add-on of a gender unit. And what did that do? It ended up, for example, for all of the staff and volunteers who went out to gather those 17,000 interviews, right, they received indication of the questions they should ask. Now, you have a belated add-on of a gender unit, and you have those people working diligently to rework and edit that list of questions so that it would have some level of gender sensitivity. By the time that's reworked and edited and gets actually out to all of those people doing that work, the majority of the interviews are already done. So the belated piece is really, really tough. So including a gender analysis from the beginning is so obviously critical. Another piece is this assumption of a homogeneous sort of category of women. Clearly there needs to be attention to multiple oppressions. The other issue is really critical is how gender typically gets reduced to women. They're not equivalent, right? So there needs to be more attention to men and masculinity, and not only as perpetrators, right? Men and masculinity, and how also that can be through a range of different experiences, including victimhood. And then, of course, thinking about institutional hierarchies. How does gender work in creating and reinforcing, or maybe undermining, institutional hierarchies? So this is a very broad and interesting area of research and thinking. Another challenge is the issue that there was very little social investment on the part of the Peruvian population for the investigation and also for the follow-up. Very little sort of investment, right? So then you really need to think about, I want to get to that one, yes. This is another really important piece before I get to the social investment part. This issue of moving past stereotypical representations of motherhood and victimhood. This is something that popped up so clearly in the public hearings and the judicial investigations of sexual violence, that in order to be able to sort of address these issues at all, the way that women were represented was either as sort of the sacrificial mother of the child that's the product of rape, and that the mother has to reconcile her unconditional love with the child of rape, and that is the one narrative that can be heard and can be incorporated into that national story, right? And it's very constricting, right? And there's tons of ways that people's experience is much more messy. And also just the typical victimhood, female victimhood, right? So these are extremely limiting, and they absolutely do not speak to the reality, right? So this is a piece that needs to be dealt with. And moving on to the procedural and methodological lessons, these processes embedded in transitional justice, and this where I'll loop back around to the social investment. I remember I asked you to look at the composition of the commissioners when that slide went up. And you may have noticed that the composition of the commissioners was quite homogeneous, right? So this is a major issue. we need in the selecting of commissioners, it has to have more attention to gender, linguistic, and cultural diversity, and all the other types of diversity that are important so that the people that are speaking and interacting feel that they are mirrored back to some extent, right? And this is the issue of diversity that we see, across academia and every other field. And then let's get to the social investment part. So how to address that issue of social investment? And there's a lot of suggestions about creating more participatory practices, that can help in developing the research designs and developing how the hearings happen and public events, how to collect the data, and defining products. Now, clearly, this is one that really butts up against limits of time and resources. Because to be able to do this, you really need a lot of dedication, a lot of more time to make these things happen. And then lastly, the challenge of guaranteeing adequate dual translation, in particular in this case, Spanish and Quechua. This is something that came up in the public hearings where there was translation from Quechua to Spanish, more or less, right? It was also not always that effective, but the translation from Spanish to Quechua was very much lacking. So that has all kinds of power relations in terms of who is this for, right? And thinking about if you want to really try to undermine the traditional power relations, you need to pay attention to this and make the communication more horizontal. So I'll revisit this after examining the feminist NGO follow-up to the Manta Vilca case, and we'll look at this again through that lens. So I'm going to take you into Huancavelica. And Huancavelica is the bolded department in the southern Andes there. And this is where Manta and Vilca are located. And this is where the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission focused that investigation and made it that emblematic case of sexual violence. So this department was one of the most heavily impacted by the conflict, and it's also it is the poorest department in Peru, with over 70% of the population living in poverty, despite its extremely wealthy natural resources. Surprised? So as the Shining Path activity increased in this region in the early 1980s, the armed forces expanded their military presence to establish bases in geostrategically located rural communities where there was this sort of real rise in Shining Path activity. So the base, the Manta Vilca military base, which if I had a laser pointer, I would point to that white, decrepit building behind the big bushy tree and the two spindly trees. There's a white building there with watchtowers. You can see those, hopefully. That military base was established in Manta in 1984, and it was present there for 11 years. And from those watchtowers, the armed forces could monitor the movement up and down the valley, and then the one road that came up to Manta, and then gave access to other communities. So there was approximately 60 personnel in that base, and they completely controlled that community, and they accumulated a horrendous track record of human rights violations. And starting with making the community build that base with their own homes, taking off doors, taking off materials to build that base. And I have more to say about that if you're interested. So this is the closer picture of the base. This was labeled, as I said, an emblematic case of how sexual violence took place in the rural context by military personnel. And the juridical unit prepared this, compilating 26 cases of assault that were perpetrated against women by soldiers and officers, both in the base, during military excursions, and on the sort of independent initiative of soldiers who had complete impunity. They knew they could do whatever they wanted. And because of the PTRC, the Commission's attention to this case, after it concluded its investigation, civil society follow-up groups were very attentive, applied for funding, and just dropped onto that community. I mean, imagine like all these NGO staff just starting to like drop into that community, right? With all of its, possibly positive and possibly very problematic dynamics. And that's what we're going to get into. So in 2004, a feminist NGO that I accompanied called DEMUS, Estudio para la Defensa y Derechos de la Mujer, began a project to follow up on the Manta Vilga case. And this image captures one of the women's group's meetings that DEMUS facilitated with the military base in the background there. So I want to tell you for a minute about DEMUS. It was established in 1987, and here I offer you their mission statement. We are a Peruvian feminist organization that defends human rights, including sexual and reproductive rights of women, promoting their free exercise and questioning the dominant cultural paradigm on women and sexuality. So the Manta Project was the first time that DEMUS undertook a project in the Andean region in Peru. Their geographic focus had always been Lima and the shanty towns around Lima. So while human rights advocates and organizations had been, following up with the majority of the human rights cases, this is the first feminist NGO to follow up and really work on a case. And I accompanied the fieldwork team in 2006 and 2007, and have continued my relationship with various of the people who work there. So to DEMUS's credit, they built an interdisciplinary fieldwork team with sociologists, psychologists, and of course, attorneys. And they worked together collaboratively, and they gained permission from the municipality of Manta to come and be there for a week each month. And their goal was to connect and establish trust to be able to then delve into some of these delicate topics. Their goal was to accompany the community and work with women who were potential victims of these crimes holistically, not just as victims. And to this end, they facilitated women's groups such as the image I showed you. They worked with local leaders, a lot of information exchange about, what is the process of reparations and so forth. They gathered information from the community about what they wanted. The community wanted them to work with the youth in the schools. That wasn't part of what they had planned, but they did that because they wanted to really respond to the needs of the community. They worked with health workers, and also they worked with regional judges and district attorneys. So this is an image to just give you a sense of the DEMUS staff. The DEMUS has always various different sort of campaigns they're running. This campaign is called Un Hombre No Viola, a man does not rape. And this campaign is to address the sexist national culture that justifies sexual violence beyond armed conflict, but sexual violence writ large. And this image of the 9 members of DEMUS staff gives you a sense of the demographic of the DEMUS staff, right? So the fieldwork team was composed, a couple of the fieldwork team are in that image, composed of very, very bright young limeñas, young women from Lima with very rudimentary Quechua-speaking language ability. So needless to say, when they arrived into the community, there was intense distrust, silence, massive cultural and linguistic gap, and it just completely forced them to rethink their disciplinary trainings. It made them rethink the assumptions underlying this project, and it made them go into this very deep collective reflection. So I want to give you an example of one of their collective reflections. Would anyone love to read this for me? Would you do that for me?
She's talking to you.
We arrived in Manta with the idea of creating psychotherapeutic and legal services for victims of violence in response to the PTRC's call to civil society organizations. We arrived with the modern colonial knowledge systems that we received through our professional training. Although we arrived with the flags of the human rights struggle flying high, our presence could easily be understood as yet another incursion intervention, like that of the military or the Shining Path. This has brought us to the practice of constant critical reflection on our assumptions, of our formation, and of the convictions we have been socialized to act.
Thank you. So what I want to hone in...
When was this? When was this reflection? The date?
2006, 2007 max.
That's progressive, yeah.
Yeah, so what I want to do is just hone in for a moment on the modern colonial knowledge systems and give a little background on that. And they, being in Peru and working in the kinds of fields they work in with their interests, were well read in the work of Aníbal Quijano, who is a Latin American decolonial theorist. So they were working through that lens. And when they say modern colonial knowledge systems, this is referring to the project of colonization in the Americas, the epistemic system entrenched by that process, and its contemporary manifestations with the modern nation state. So more broadly, talking about coloniality, this encompasses the modes of control that Europeans used to manage their American and Caribbean colonies. And those would be modes including social, political, epistemic, sexual, economic modes of domination that perpetuate injustice, commodification, and clearly the disregard for human life. And on the flip side, you have the celebratory narrative of modernity that is based on the European sort of framework, thinking that this is identified with progress, with development, and it is on the flip side with coloniality. So that's sort of the reference point there. So the fieldwork team and Demos more broadly had to come to terms with so much that just threw them back, trying to figure out how to address this incredible cultural linguistic gap, the general distrust and very specific distrust of the state and the legal process, the complete illegitimacy of the national legal process and the promises of justice, and that the state could be in any way a protector or a benefactor. The state is the perpetrator, right? And in all of this, of course, trying to translate levels of scale in terms of international human rights law, community reference points for justice and legal process, and all of that was just very overwhelming. So what did they do in response? They took time to debrief and collectively theorize about what was going on, how to do this work with veterans, psychologists, and sociologists who had been integral in the PTRC investigation. And they did a lot of collective reflection, and they attempted to, just basically say, let's take a step back. Let's not try to push to try to get these testimonies, and let's take a year to work in the community to explore concepts of justice, reparations, health, and well-being on the terms of the community, to connect and try to learn the language and open their epistemic reference points. So earlier I highlighted the challenges and lessons through the framework of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and now I want to go back to those thinking about this project. And one of the main differences is that Demos didn't have that very limited time frame. If they were able to secure funding, they could continue on and on and on and on, right? And also, they were, very much committed to this, right? So they were able to secure funding to work. They started in 2004, they worked in the community until 2008, and then they worked from the city of Huancavelica from 2008 to 2012 with the select group that were wanting to continue on with this process. So let's look at these same kind of issues, the structural. Well, clearly they included a gender analysis from the beginning. They, in theory, were attentive to multiple oppressions, but in practice, clearly had a great difficulty in being able to address that. They did look at this issue peripherally. They looked at men and masculinity and institutional hierarchies, and they will continue in the future to do that, and that's what I'll come to at the end. And they were very much moving past the stereotypical representations and very much being aware of how complicated and messy people's lives are and how many of us can live seemingly very contradictory roles at the same time or at different times in our life, right? So very much kind of going past the limited narrative of females that was taking place within the Commission's historical truth. In terms of the procedural and methodological, this issue, this is one of their main weaknesses, the very much lack of diversity. Age, they were all very junior, and clearly if they had been able to maintain, they had senior people who accompanied them for a year here and there, who did speak Quechua, and those were moments that created enormous growth in the links and the possibilities, but that was not consistent. So this is, and they also had some men that came with them, which also, like it or not, established more legitimacy for their project. All of these issues, extremely limiting. They did take a lot of time to try to develop social investment with very mixed results. And they clearly did not guarantee the language translation. So given all of this very limited capacity, I want to turn to sort of the current, back to this case in its current state, and how can it be, given all that limited capacity, that they ended up representing 3 women. So in 2006, 3 women at different moments came to the staff and asked to be represented and wanted to give their testimonies. And I will never forget, there was this one evening, and there wasn't at that time electricity in the community, so we were just chatting and thinking together over candlelight, and we heard a knock on the door, and a woman was there with her daughter, teenage daughter, and she came in and she said she wanted to give her story. She wanted to deliver her story, and she wanted Demos to take it up. And of course, the one attorney who was not even done with her degree looked and said, okay, so we all moved into the other room quickly, which was separated by like a curtain, right? And we just sort of huddled quietly not to make a peep or disturb them. And hours passed in which the mother spoke in mostly Quechua, some Spanish. The daughter translated the whole testimony, and this very novice attorney was taking that testimony by hand. And it was one of those incredibly fragile moments where we were all on pins and needles. And the moment that, this all finished and they left, the attorney came through the curtains and her eyes were just like platters. This was her first real case that she was going to take on. She was not even through her training, and she had just received hours of a testimony. So this is to give you sort of a feeling of the intensity of how fragile this process has been. And then subsequently, 2 more women came forth. So a decade later, we're waiting for the date so that this goes to trial. In terms of the indictment, I told you that it includes 12 soldiers and 2 officials. And I mentioned to you that Demos is one representing organization, and IDL, the Instituto de Defensa Legal, is the other representing human rights organization for another set of sexual violence violations under the rubric of torture. Well, the attorneys are thinking together about how during the trial, more information will come out about chain of command, right? During the trial, they will be able to connect who were the higher ups. So the trial is seen as sort of like the first step, and then the next piece that they will build towards is to be able to determine that chain of command farther up and arm together another case following that, right? So this is sort of looking towards the future. And I want to talk a little bit about the collaborative process, the psycho-juridical process that Demos has facilitated. And one piece of this has been coming together the 3 women that they're representing and all the attorneys and related staff to collectively theorize or plan out what is their security measures they're taking to assess their conditions, where they live, their assets, their resources, their networks of support, and clearly their vulnerabilities. Because as this goes to trial, it's very likely they are going to receive, threats or physical attacks. The other thing that they've done that's in terms of collaborative process is this last year, 2015, because these 3 women live in different parts of Peru, so bringing them together twice a month for a day-long meeting, twice a month in which they prepare for the trial. So, of course, they're walking through mock trials. They're creating this space in which all those 14 soldiers and officials will be standing there while they're giving their testimony. Like the feeling that's going to come out of that and how to be prepared for that In various instances, they've brought family members, children, and partners to prepare the family to be able to maneuver through this process. And more interestingly, they have also worked with these 3 women to do political advocacy with the Congress people in Peru around the Rome Statute and integrating it into the Penal Code, which is a very stalled process, as well as moving along the Integral Plan for Reparations, which is also a very stalled process. So to give you a sense of what they're doing today and moving forward. And then the other thing I want to say is that even if there's this beautiful sentence that comes out of this, it's not going to have any impact unless there is a major communicational campaign. As one of the attorneys said, que cale en la mente de las personas. That it just doesn't end up being a sentence that kind of, okay, it's done, but that it has impact on people to rethink these issues. And lastly, I want to think a little bit about solidarity efforts in terms of, clearly you can tell this matters to me. So what can I do, or what can people who feel driven to support do, similar to the Sepulveda Zarco case? What kind of solidarity can we do to be sure this case actually gets a date? It doesn't get buried. To be sure that it's taken with the seriousness that it needs to be taken with. To be sure that the victims are treated with the respect necessary and not stereotyped into these kinds of terrible kinds of questionings that re-victimize, right? What are the things that I'm thinking in conversation with the people who are managing this case and the communicational staff at Demos, the timing and what I can offer as a activist-oriented academic in the North. So to close, what I want to do is just dedicate this talk to those women and their tenacity and their healing process. Thank you.
Excuse me, I'm going to set the timer to make sure I stay within. And we have plenty of time for the Q&A. My name is Angelica Bernal, and I'm a professor in the Political Science Department. I want to thank the organizers of the conference, Jamie and Sonia, for this opportunity, and particularly to thank Pasha for this opportunity to reflect and offer a couple of comments on her work. This book was an incredible learning experience for me. I'm not an expert in this topic, but it was a revelation, so I really, really appreciated and enjoyed your talk. So with that said, I also want to apologize for reading it rather formally, but I want to make sure that I don't forget all the things that I have to say on something that I think is such a rich book with so much detail that's so theoretically driven but also empirically grounded, so that we can start off our discussion. So a year before the inauguration of Peru's Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2001, the theater troupe Grupo Cultural Yuyashkani presented their interpretation of Peruvian poet Jose Watanabe's play Antigonia. Now, Grupo Yuyashkani, which you mentioned brilliantly in your book, their name in Quechua means I am thinking, I am remembering, or I am your thoughts, I am your memory. And in keeping with this name and their purpose, the play touched on a lot of issues concerning collective memory and conscience in the midst of war, by way of focusing on Antigonia's or Antigone's from the Sophocles play, her struggle to mourn the loss of her brother and retrieve his body to ensure a proper burial. To do so, she has to face a dominant ruling power, King Creon, and act in defiance of his edict preventing her brother's mourning and burial. So mourning, loss, a family member disappeared, a woman's activism and struggle for justice in the face of seemingly insurmountable state power. Like Antigonia, Rosa Cuchillo, the title of another Peruvian production that features in this beautiful cover of your book, is an emblematic representation of all the mothers of the disappeared. And one of the many Rosa Cuchillos that you encountered, that Bueno Hansen encounters in her research, retells of her endless struggle to find her disappeared daughter, a struggle that appears without end.
As a result, Rosa Cuchillo lives in a state of suspended animation, searching for a justice that day after day eludes her and many others. In another revealing moment in her book, Bueno Hansen recounts the testimony of Dorisa Yesca at the public hearing on political violence and political crimes against women. Frozen on the stage, distraught when addressed in Spanish, Yesca's testimony, which she spoke in Quechua, eluded the PTRCs, just the shorthand we'll refer for the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, their frame of time, their frame of narration, and their language, as you pointed out, revealing a moment of deep incommensurability. Her truth would not be understood. Now, in his recent book titled Truth Commissions, published this year, Onur Bakiner writes, Truth Commissions offer a peculiar solution to one of the key problems of contemporary politics, recovering the factual truth about past violations and narrating national history in the context of national rebuilding. Their prominence in today's world reflects a hope shared by many citizens, civil society activists, intellectuals, and politicians that a self-critique of the past will help rebuild a divided nation on the basis of shared values. So if this is the hope, then justice and reconciliation seem to be the core promises. Yet as these plays speak to, and the testimonies of the everyday Rosa Cuchillos and Dorisa Yescas reveal, reconciliation and justice 14 years after the closure of the PTRC is far from reality. Perhaps the problem resides on these contested definitions of these key terms and purposes at the heart of all Truth and Reconciliation Commission things like justice, reconciliation, and truth, these essentially contested terms. Yet, rather than focusing on these normative problems, and the stake with these particular concepts, I think what was really valuable in reading your book, Bueno Hansen's book, is that you give us another venue for getting into these issues, another form of inquiry, one that is theoretically rich but also empirically grounded. And it draws on this intersectional and decolonial feminist approach that I want to highlight, which I think is really great. Presenting a framework that turns our attention on two large issues, which is one, who's rendered a subject and how? And two, how is harm of these subjects framed? Now, these are questions that close to my own heart. Although I'm not an expert on these issues, I do work on Indigenous people and thinking about how they're construed as subjects, and particularly how harm is construed in relation to them is something really close to my new work. And it's also something that I think your book makes really important contributions to scholars and activists working on these issues, not just in Peru, but beyond and outside of transitional justice. Now, in the time I have today, I want to focus on those two questions as they played out in some of the cases, including the one you talked. So this study focused on gender-based violence, as you discussed, as the issue through which to engage through these transitional justice processes. According to the PTRC's final report, as you highlighted, the majority of the victims were indigenous. They were indigenous Andean Quechuan speakers and Amazonian speakers, which was likewise reflected in the issue on violence and who was the target of violence. Most of the targets were Quechua-speaking campesinas, or peasant women. Now, while targets themselves, the Quechua campesinas were those Rosa Cuchillos. They were tireless fighters. They were advocates who combed through the mass graves, who traveled at their own cost with little resources to the lawyer's office and pushed to find answers about their loved ones' disappearances and the crimes committed against their families and their communities. In your analysis, you find that both their protagonism, the protagonism of these women, and with them many aspects of gender violence and focusing on gender violence was sidelined not only in civil society, so by groups like feminist movements, but also importantly within the processes themselves, as we've seen in the talk today, and in the PTRC and its related hearings and the prosecution of cases. Now, the PTRC has been lauded as a truth commission that's very strong, yet despite its best efforts, as you discussed and presented so well in the book, incorporating gender analysis into its processes proved a double-edged sword, as you call it. Now, on the one hand, the Commission created these spaces for gender analysis through the creation of its gender unit, yet on the other hand, its implementation, gender analysis, reproduced and upheld existing social hierarchies, and prominent among these being gender, ethnicity, and geography. At the source of these problems, one of the issues seemed to be particularly on its face focus on sexual violence and particularly rape, rather than more broadly gendered aspects of human rights violations, as I understood from the book, and also its separation of gender from ethno-linguistic factors, that is, thinking of gender as something that is equatable to just women, without an equal focus on crimes committed against them, not simply by virtue of being women, but also indigenous. Their indigeneity alongside gender reflected, of course, as we know, long-standing legacies of colonial exploitation and domination. We have to take that into consideration, understand why these gender violence crimes were committed against them. Now, with regards to the focus on sexual violence, particularly rape, this was very insightful, and particularly it showed the importance of expanding and applying intersectional approaches. Something that I'm familiar with, as well as the decolonial feminist approach, because it really revealed some of the limitations in fully accounting with the violations and fully giving us an account of violence. If the purpose of these truth commissions is to rescind, an account of the past, and the past being one laden with violence, how do we do that? Well, this is problematic in the way it was doing that. And particularly just focusing on rapes leaves all sorts of other forms of gender violence aside. Particularly, one thing that I wasn't aware of, and you highlighted, was things like the forced sterilization of women under the Fujimori administration. Now, it also had several crucial subject effects. For instance, constraining and limited women and their testimonies to the subject position of victims. They always had to position themselves as victims, number one, and number two, the very individualistic focus. Now, both had further effects of reinforcing gender stereotypes, but also I think had problems with regards to indigenous people, and that individualistic focus being a troubling limitation as well. In my new project with Dr. Nandini Dev from Lehigh University, we've been examining the framing of bodily harm to vulnerable individuals in human rights campaigns, and have been interested in interrogating further what makes bodily harm so salient as a focus for human rights violations and justice claims, and the effects such framing has on constituting particular subjects over others. Now, some of the questions that have arisen in the course of our research is whether it's possible to assert harm as well as strength in a subject, and to what extent bodily harm works for certain subjects and not others, as there may be hierarchies of groups that are more deserving of being seen as unjustly harmed, and which harms are perceived worse than others. Now, within that hierarchy, the issue of sexual violence, particularly rapes, is one of those harms that is amongst those perceived to be the worst. For its consequences on individuals, families, communities, and the broader social fabric. Its construction of subjects of rape strictly in the term of victimhood, and which you highlighted, is deeply problematic. Now, in cases like Peru, you argued it has